Mom sent a message. We changed all the locks on the front door and also the gate code. We no longer. And that was it. No explanation. No signature. Not even a period at the end. Just a severed sentence. I sat in my rental car. Engine, still running. Eyes frozen on the screen. The Portland rain streaking down the windshield, like the silence that followed. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to reply, or if there was anything left to say. My name is Liam Hemsworth. I'm 35 years old. I'm a real estate strategist and interior advisor. Or at least I was. Until last month. I thought I had a home, not just the house. A family, a foundation. And all of that crumbled with a single message. But to really understand how it got here, you'd have to go back 2 years when I made the mistake of trusting blood over logic. My father passed away from a stroke on a quiet Wednesday in October. He wasn't perfect, but he was the one who balanced things. After his funeral, I made a choice I thought was honorable. I put my own condo purchase on hold and moved back into the family house in Forest Park, just outside Portland. It was a mess. Structurally sound, but emotionally cluttered. The kitchen was falling apart, the yard overgrown, and inside, well, it was a time capsule of everything unspoken. My mom, Harper. I was still there, but barely present. And my younger brother Dylan had taken up semi-permanent residence in the garage, claiming it as his content creation studio, which basically meant ring lights, unpaid bills, and video games on mute at 3 a.m. I didn't complain. I just did what I do. I assessed, planned, and rebuilt. I hired contractors, refinanced the loan under my name, since neither Mom nor Dylan qualified. I covered costs, designed a more efficient interior layout, and updated everything from insulation to fixtures. All expenses over $150. 000 across 18 months came from me. No contracts. No expectations beyond decency. My mother watched from the sidelines, occasionally complimenting the backsplash or criticizing the paint. Dylan, in typical form, posted before and after shots to his followers, claiming the renovations were a family vision. I let it go. Because I believed it was still our house. I still remember the day the house felt finished. I had just installed the final fixtures in the guest bathroom. Clean lines. Brushed gold. Minimalist. But warm. I stood back. Exhausted. But satisfied. Renee, my fiancé at the time, hugged me in the hallway and said, "You turned this place into something real." That night, I sat with my mom in the new kitchen I designed, drinking tea. She seemed relaxed for once. Even proud. "Your father would have loved this," she said quietly. I took that as my reward. I didn't ask for more. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have gotten it in writing. Aved. A name change. A single page of acknowledgement. But you don't think you'll need a contract with your own mother. You think rebuilding a home means rebuilding trust. But I was wrong. What builds power isn't just effort. It's control. And in this family, control was never mine to begin with. The unraveling started small. Missed dinners. Whispers. I wasn't supposed to hear. Dylan meeting with Trevor. An old friend of mine turned brand partner. A month later, I found out they were pitching a content series based in the house, using the story of a family. Reinventing their legacy. I wasn't even mentioned. Trevor didn't respond to my calls. My mom waved it off as Dylan's project. "He needs direction," she said, as if I wasn't already providing that in the form of shelter, equity, and sacrifice. Renee was growing restless. "This house doesn't feel like yours," she said one night. "It feels like you're renting your own life from them." I laughed it off. I told myself that I was building something that would eventually be mine. That I just had to hold on. And then I went on a 3-day client trip to San Francisco. When I returned, my key didn't work. The keypad blinked red. I tried again. and again. Then checked my phone. That's when I saw it. Mom's message. We changed all the locks on the front door and also the gate code. We no longer. I never finished reading the sentence. I didn't have to. Because I already understood. They were done with me. Quietly. Finally. Permanently. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing I'd handed them every tool they used to erase me. I had renovated my own exile, funded my own lockout, and the people I thought I was saving were already planning how to live without me. So I put the phone down, and I drove. Not to a friend, not to a lawyer, just forward. Because when your whole life is pulled out from under you by the people you trust most, the only direction left is away. I checked into a budget motel on the south side of the city with nothing but my suitcase, my laptop, and the echo of that message in my chest. My phone kept lighting up, mostly from Renee at first. Where are you? Did something happen? Should I be worried? I didn't reply. I couldn't. My entire body felt like it was holding its breath underwater. I stared at the ceiling for hours that night. Not sleeping. Just thinking. Not about revenge. Not yet. Just disbelief. I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with my mother the past few months. Every nod she gave while I showed her the new backsplash. Every silence she offered when Dylan called the house his. I thought I was building for all of us. I hadn't noticed they were just waiting for me to leave. By day 3, I had to tell Renee. I met her at a cafe near her apartment. I could see the moment she realized how serious it was. That I wasn't just exaggerating. They changed the locks on you, she repeated. And you're still paying the utilities. I nodded. Not anymore, I added. Although I hadn't actually canceled anything yet. That conversation ended with her suggesting we take some space. She didn't say it was over. But her eyes did. I didn't blame her. I wasn't present. I wasn't whole. I had lost the center of my life. And I didn't know who I was without it. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Dylan and Trevor launched their series, Heritage Reimagined. They called it an online renovation series, documenting the transformation of our childhood home into a modern symbol of family legacy and digital creativity. My name wasn't mentioned once, but my designs were everywhere. The custom light fixtures I chose, the layout I restructured, even the tile samples I paid for, now credited as a vision Dylan brought to life. My inbox started filling with confused messages from old clients and collaborators. Is this your project? Thought you were behind this, what happened? Some were polite. Some less so. How could you let them steal your work? I didn't answer any of them. The fallout at work came slowly, then all at once. I'd been operating as an independent advisor for over 4 years. Clients came to me for tailored renovation strategies and long-term real estate positioning. But now, search results linked me to a vague disappearance from a project that was getting traction. A few clients froze contracts. One sent a formal termination email, citing reputational risk. Nate, a former colleague and now head of a boutique firm, called to check in. But it was clear he was also confirming I hadn't lost my mind. You always struck me as someone who had his house in order, he said gently. I didn't think this would be your story. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. I didn't think this would be my story either. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being erased. Not humiliated publicly. Not arrested or exposed, but slowly, methodically, made irrelevant. Every part of my contribution to the house had become invisible. My mother was now calling it Dylan's project in every interview. Trevor paraded as the creative force. The show was being picked up by local media. I watched from my motel room as my blueprint became their background. And I stayed quiet. Because part of me still wanted to believe it was a mistake. That someone, anyone, would speak up and say, "Wait, wasn't this Liam's?" But no one did. One night, I drove past the house. The same house I had brought back from rot and water damage. The same house I had envisioned with Renee when we talked about kids and holidays. There was a new sign out front. Home by Hemsworth. It was Dylan's new brand. I parked across the street, engine off, and just sat there, watching the lights flicker through the living room. I could see silhouettes, people laughing, filming, celebrating something. I don't know what broke more in that moment, my pride or my hope. I went back to the motel and finally opened my laptop. I logged into the bank. I saw the mortgage account still listed under my profile. Auto pay still active. Still paying the loan. Still covering the water and electric. Still tied to the very place I was no longer welcome. I hovered my cursor over the cancel button, but didn't click. Not yet. I wasn't ready to be done. I wasn't ready to disappear completely. Not without understanding how everything had unraveled. Instead, I opened a new document. I started writing. Not a blog. Not a lawsuit. Just facts. Timeline. Payments. Screenshots. Emails. Receipts. Conversations. A full account of what I had contributed. What I had built. And how it had been rewritten without me. I didn't know what I would do with it. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let the story end with that text message. I couldn't let them be the only ones writing my legacy. 3 weeks after the message, I was still in that same motel. The carpet smelled like old coffee. The window didn't quite close all the way. And every morning, I'd wake to the sound of leaf blowers and dogs barking through paper-thin walls. But it was quiet. Quiet enough to think. Quiet enough to feel everything I'd been trying not to. Losing the house didn't just hurt because it was mine. It hurt because it was the one place I thought I was safe. I'd poured my identity into its walls, into its angles and light and structure, watching it become someone else's platform, watching Dylan stand on it like a crown he earned. I was like being erased from my own reflection. No news articles called it betrayal. No journalist asked about the person who funded the whole transformation. Because the theft of emotional labor isn't a scandal, it's a footnote. One afternoon, I drove out to the East Hills to visit someone I hadn't seen in years. Mr. Green. He used to be my father's friend. A retired architect who lived alone in a small bungalow surrounded by grapevines and tools from another century. When I arrived, he was out front sanding a birdhouse. "You look thinner," he said. Not unkindly. I nodded. "Heard about the project." "The house." I raised an eyebrow. "It's getting press." I told him the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. That I built it. Paid for it. That now I was out. And Dylan was in. He listened. Slowly nodding. Like someone taking inventory of rot behind drywall. "So what are you going to do now?" he asked. "Burn it down." I shook my head. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I just want to breathe again." He smiled. "Then build something else. But this time, make sure your name's on the plans." That stuck with me. Not just the advice, but the simplicity of it. Build again. Own it this time. Not in title, but in truth. So I went back to the motel, pulled out the folder of documents I had been compiling, and started organizing. Not just for me, but for clarity. The truth didn't need to be shouted, but it had to exist. Every receipt, every photo, every message that proved who I was and what I gave. I wasn't sure if I would ever go public, but I needed to reclaim the narrative. And sometimes, that starts by simply writing it down. Meanwhile, I started reaching out quietly. Not to the media. Not yet. But to old clients, past collaborators. I didn't explain the whole situation, just offered help, consulting, problem solving. A few projects came back. A small redesign in the Pearl District. A remote consultation for a couple in Bend. Modest jobs. Enough to keep me moving. To remind me I still had something to offer. I worked from the motel desk with my laptop propped on a cardboard box and my phone hotspotted to the television. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. There was no production crew filming me for content. No fake smiles. Just process. Just work. And slowly, something inside me started to shift. I wasn't okay yet, but I was present. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was healing. I started reading again, running at dawn, answering emails. I made a deal with myself. I wouldn't engage unless it was necessary. No more watching their videos. No more checking the press. No more hoping for apologies that would never come. My therapist, Dr. Weaver, called it emotional detachment. You don't have to forgive to move forward, she said. You just have to stop giving them your bandwidth. The real turning point came 2 months in, when a client I hadn't worked with in years reached out. A tech couple building their first home in Ashland. They had followed my early work and were looking for a minimalist interior with emotional flow, her words. Not mine. I drove down to meet them in person. During the consultation, they asked, "Are you still doing big projects? We saw something recently, but you weren't listed." I paused, then answered with clarity. That was my last project. I chose to step away, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was lying. I had stepped away, not willingly, not on fair terms, but I had made a choice to stay away, to reclaim the oxygen they had been draining from me since the day I started giving more than they ever deserved. That night, I didn't go back to the motel. I booked a small cabin in the mountains for the weekend. I didn't tell anyone, just disappeared into the trees and let myself feel the full weight of everything I'd lost. And then, everything I still had, my craft, my clarity, my name. They hadn't taken that, not yet, and they wouldn't again. The cabin weekend gave me something I hadn't felt in months: quiet, ownership of my own time. I hiked. I cooked simple meals. I fell asleep without noise from the city or the motel television humming in the background. No family texts. No forwarded screenshots. No Dylan on a live stream explaining the emotional concept behind a hallway I designed. Just air. When I returned to Portland, I moved out of the motel, found a small rental studio space above a garage on the east side. Nothing fancy, but it had a window that caught morning light and floors that didn't squeak. I brought nothing but my laptop, a folding table, and a twin mattress. Starting over didn't scare me anymore. Losing myself had been far worse. Clients trickled in referrals from people who remembered how I worked before the family saga swallowed my name. Elena Martin was one of them. A real estate analyst I'd helped 3 years ago during her first house flip. She reached out asking for help redesigning her new investment property. I said yes. It was supposed to be just another job, but during a lunch break in the middle of drywall discussions, she asked, "So, why'd you disappear from the industry for a while?" I hesitated, then told her half the truth. That I got tied up in a family project. That it became complicated. That I was learning to separate personal trust from professional work. She nodded slowly, then said something I didn't expect. I had a brother like that once. Took my money and said I owed him love. She didn't push me further, just slid her phone across the table. If you ever want to talk to someone about protecting yourself legally, let me know. I've got a good contact. Quiet, clean, discreet. I saved the number. Didn't use it yet. But knowing it was there, that I had an option, meant more than I could admit. Meanwhile, the buzz around Dylan's brand started to shift. Not much at first, but I noticed it. Comments on his videos started asking questions. Why aren't you crediting the original designer? Where's your brother? Wasn't this Liam's vision? They were quickly deleted. Of course. But screenshots made their way to me via old followers who had quietly kept the receipts. One sent me a message. "You don't deserve this. But it's not over." I didn't reply, but I read that message more than once. Not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that silence isn't always defeat. Sometimes, it's strategy. Then came the article. Not an exposé, just a lifestyle piece in a local architecture blog. The tone was cheerful, surface level, full of soft praise for Dylan's natural design instincts. But buried in paragraph 7 was a line. Sources close to the project mention an early involvement by Dylan's older brother. Though details remain unclear, it was the first time my name, or at least my existence, had been acknowledged in any version of the story. I stared at that sentence for a long time. It wasn't justice, but it was a crack in the paint, a flaw in the narrative they had worked so hard to control. I still hadn't spoken to my mother. She hadn't reached out. Not since the lock message. But Aunt Carol, her older sister, called me one evening. I almost didn't answer. But something told me to pick up. Her voice was cautious, but familiar. I heard what happened, she said. I don't agree with how they handled it. I just want you to know, your father would have been heartbroken. I didn't say anything, she continued. Harper's pretending everything's fine, but she's stretched thin. Dylan's show isn't bringing in the kind of sponsorship he promised. And Trevor. She paused. He's under investigation. Some shady financing on another project in Seattle. That caught my attention. I asked nothing, just listened. She ended the call with one sentence that sat with me for days. Sometimes the silence from the one you betrayed is the loudest weight you carry. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post anything. But I did feel something shift again. They were beginning to feel the weight of what they'd done, not because I demanded it, but because they had built everything on a version of the truth that couldn't sustain itself, and I had built nothing. Yet. But I was about to. Because in between my small jobs and evening runs and quiet evenings sketching ideas no one would see yet, I had begun planning. Not for revenge. For reinvention. A space that wasn't just about design, but about emotional recovery. A place for people who'd lost homes in ways no one talks about through betrayal. Silence, or sacrifice. I didn't know what to call it yet. But the idea had a pulse, and for the first time in months, so did I. 2 months into my new rhythm, I stopped checking for news about Dylan. Not out of indifference, but because I didn't need to anymore. The cracks were widening on their own. Sponsorships were quietly pulling back. The 5th episode of his renovation series was delayed, then released with a noticeable drop in quality. One interior angle had exposed wiring, my wiring which had since been modified without permit. Several viewers commented on code violations, and the thread was shut down within hours. I didn't have to say a word. The truth was doing the work for me. And I had more important things to focus on. The idea that had started in the cabin just a seed was now taking shape. I called it Found Form. It wasn't a company. Not yet. It was more like a philosophy. A lens through which people could rebuild after emotional displacement. I sketched concepts on scrap paper, drafted taglines, researched trauma-informed design practices. Turns out, there was a whole field of study connecting emotional safety with spatial design, how lighting affects anxiety, how ceiling height changes self-perception, how textures and layout can restore a sense of control after life fractures it. It wasn't just about furniture. It was about framing healing. I pitched the concept to Elena, not as a client proposal, but as a conversation. She leaned in across her coffee cup and said, "You know, if you build this right, it's going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Because it's not just design, it's a declaration." I told her, that's exactly what I wanted it to be. She smiled, then offered something unexpected. I have a friend at Reshape Ventures. They fund early-stage concepts, especially ones tied to wellness and living spaces. I can make an introduction if you're ready. I said yes. Not because I felt ready, but because I finally understood that waiting for permission was what got me locked out in the first place. The pitch wasn't flashy. No video montages. No stage drama. Just me. A screen. And the truth. I talked about how space holds memory, How losing your place in your own family can feel like being erased from a home you paid for. How design could help people re-establish that sense of presence. The lead partner, a quiet woman named Iris, asked one question at the end. Did this come from something personal? I looked her in the eye and said, yes, that was it. The meeting ended. A week later, they called back with a modest offer. Seed funding. Enough to build a pilot project. No strings. Just proof of concept. I accepted. I didn't tell anyone. Not Renee. Not old colleagues. Not even Mr. Green. I wanted the work to speak first this time. Not the pitch. Not the packaging. Just the work. I started renting a small industrial unit in a part of town where no one cared what your last name was. The kind of place where you could be anonymous and brilliant at the same time. I put up a whiteboard. Started mapping. Not just rooms, but feelings. Not just materials, but memory. My goal wasn't to compete with what Dylan had stolen. It was to build what he never could, something real. Something earned. Something sustainable. In the meantime, a new message arrived. From an unfamiliar number. Short. Cold. Legal notice pending. Property claim under dispute. No name attached. But I knew it was them. Likely Trevor. Trying to bluff. I forwarded it to Elena. She barely reacted. They're desperate, she said. They're trying to get ahead of something they know is already slipping. Do you want to respond? I thought for a moment, then shook my head. No. Let the silence answer for now. And that became my strategy. I wouldn't go public. Not yet. I wouldn't send emails to the press or comment under their videos. But I would be present. Not in their story. In mine. By the end of that month, I had signed a lease on a second unit, this one, for clients. A small walk-through gallery space where I could demo the emotional environments I was crafting. No logos. No personal branding. Just soft wood, calming tones. Spaces that made you breathe slower the moment you walked in. I held one private event. 6 people. Word of mouth only. One client wept when she sat on a bench by the window and said, "This feels like how I wanted my house to feel before the divorce." That's when I knew. I wasn't just recovering. I was rebuilding. And what I was building couldn't be taken this time. Not through locks. Not through silence. Not even through blood. By the time the pilot space of Foundform had been open for 2 months, word had started to spread. Slowly. Intentionally. Not viral. Not trending. Just real people telling real people. There's a space in Portland where you can feel like yourself again. I wasn't in the photos. I didn't speak at launch events. I let the space speak for itself. One room was called Recovery. Another, Quiet Authority. And the third, Unseen Work. Every detail from the curved doorways to the weight of the chairs was a reflection of everything I had once given without acknowledgement. But now, it was mine. Fully. Authentically. Quietly. Then came the phone call. I didn't expect. A journalist named Lauren Fields. She had covered Dylan's launch nearly a year ago. Her voice was calm. Measured. I know this is forward. But I've been following what you've been doing with Foundform. Would you be open to an off-the-record conversation? I paused. Unsure. No publication. She added. Just understanding. There's something missing from their version of the story. I can feel it. I agreed. We met at a coffee shop downtown. She asked thoughtful questions. She didn't pry. Didn't push. I told her enough. I showed her photos. Einvoice. Messages. I never asked her to publish anything. I didn't need exposure. I just needed the truth to have a witness. Meanwhile, trouble was clearly brewing back at the house. One of Dylan's sponsors, Covenant Home Goods, quietly pulled out of their contract. Rumors surfaced that certain permits had never been filed correctly. And Trevor. He disappeared from all promotional materials. A source from inside the production team leaked screenshots of heated texts between him and Dylan, arguing over unpaid contractors and legal liability. The show's social media account went dark. And just like that, the noise started to collapse on itself. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Just a slow, public unraveling. Then, one evening, I received a message from a blocked number. No name. Just a line: "If you still have the paperwork, maybe we can talk." Things got out of hand. I read it twice. Once to understand. Once to confirm that I felt nothing. No bitterness. No fear. No curiosity. Just clarity. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Elena, who confirmed what I already knew. If they wanted anything from me now, it wasn't because they missed me. It was because they needed something they couldn't recreate. Ownership, stability, trust, all of which they had traded away for applause that didn't last. At the same time, people who had once distanced themselves started to circle back. A former mentor emailed to say he admired the work I was doing. A podcast host invited me to talk not about family betrayal, but about spatial psychology and emotional restoration. I declined the interview, but I thanked him. I wasn't hiding anymore. I just didn't need to explain myself through the lens of loss. I was building something new, something forward-facing, something that didn't need to drag the past behind it like dead weight. But the most unexpected message came from Renee. Nearly a year since we last spoke. It was short, thoughtful. "I saw the space. I walked through it last weekend. I didn't know it was yours until the end. I cried in the unseen workroom. Just wanted you to know." I sat with that message for a long time. She hadn't come to apologize. She didn't ask to talk. She didn't even mention the engagement. Just a simple acknowledgement that something I created had reached her. That was enough. I didn't respond, but I saved it. As for my mother, still no word. Not a message. Not a letter. Dylan, I heard, had moved into an apartment downtown, far from the family house. Rumor was, the home had been refinanced again. But barely. Aunt Carol said they were scrambling to keep it afloat. The market wasn't forgiving, especially when the foundation was built on image, not structure. "They keep thinking you'll come back," she told me, "like you'll just walk in and fix it, the same way you always did." I didn't respond. Because what they didn't understand, and probably never would, was that I hadn't walked away out of pride. I had walked away to survive. And now, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. A few weeks later, Aunt Carol called again. She never asked for anything. Just updated me the way someone reports the weather. Calm. Unbiased. She told me the family house had officially entered pre-foreclosure. Missed payments. Delayed taxes. Dylan had stopped contributing months ago. Apparently, the sponsorship checks had dried up, and his credit cards were maxed out. My mother, she said, was selling off antiques. Not to downsize. To survive. I listened. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel joy at their collapse. What I felt was confirmation. This is what happens when you build something on someone else's sacrifice and pretend it was yours. In the months after Found Form took off, I had signed 2 long-term consulting contracts with clients who didn't care about my last name or what I had been through. They cared about how I listened, how I translated emotion into structure. I wasn't a brand. I was a person again. Whole. And the more I worked, the more I realized I had never been less visible than when I was part of that house. That family. That false narrative. In their world, I was always the support beam, critical but unseen. Now, I was the blueprint. The one setting the tone, the one making the rules. I didn't need applause. I needed space. And I had earned it. Then came the letter. Not a message. Not a call. A real letter. Handwritten. From my mother. The handwriting was uneven, as if it had been written in a hurry. or maybe with trembling hands. She said she didn't know where to begin, that she had watched everything fall apart piece by piece and kept hoping I would return. She said she missed Sunday mornings and the way the kitchen smelled after I installed the new stove. She mentioned the trees in the backyard and how Dylan had tried to plant new ones, but they never took root. The sentence that stayed with me was this: "We should have seen it, how everything worked when you were here, and how quietly it broke when you left." There was no apology in that letter, no acknowledgement of locking me out, or letting my name be erased. Just grief. Not for me, but for the comfort I used to provide. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The point had never been to punish her. It was to release myself from the contract I'd never signed, but had always been bound by, to fix what they kept breaking. Meanwhile, a client referred me to a local TED-style conference. They asked if I'd speak not about my story, but about the emotional architecture of space. I accepted. The stage was small, maybe 70 people in the room. I didn't mention my family. Not once. I spoke about loss without naming names, about recovery without needing revenge, about how space isn't just what we walk through, but what we carry inside. The audience was quiet when I finished. Then they stood. Not because I had said something dramatic, but because they saw someone who had been torn down quietly and rebuilt even more quietly. That's what real power looks like. Not volume. Stability. Later that evening, someone approached me after the talk. Mid-30-second. Nervous energy. "I followed the renovation series last year," he admitted. "I always felt like something was off, like there was someone missing behind the scenes." I smiled, then said the simplest truth I knew: there usually is. I returned home that night and sat in the corner of my space, light spilling through the window onto the hardwood floor. I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like an architect again. Not of houses, of meaning, of memory, of identity. I didn't need to rebuild the past. I had built something better. And the irony, I had done it without them even noticing. While they were busy preserving a shell of the story, I had already stepped into the next chapter. Quietly, firmly, fully. One Thursday morning, my assistant told me someone had left a handwritten note at the entrance to the gallery. It was folded neatly, taped to the glass door, unsigned. Inside, it simply said, "We know we hurt you. We want to talk. Please." I didn't ask who we meant. I already knew. The handwriting was Dylan's. Slanted, sharp, trying too hard to look casual. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But then I folded the paper back up, placed it in my drawer, and let it sit there for a week. When I finally responded, it wasn't with anger. I sent a message through Aunt Carol. If they want to meet, it won't be at their house, and it won't be to revisit old wounds. It'll be to say things face to face. Once. And let them go. Nothing more. She agreed. She offered her home as a neutral place. Sunday afternoon. 2 o'clock. No audience. No lawyers. Just the people who once shared a name. That day, I arrived 5 minutes early. I sat in my truck. Engine off. Heart still. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't hopeful. I was ready. When I walked in, Aunt Carol gave me a nod and disappeared into the kitchen. Dylan was already there, pacing. He looked thinner, less polished. My mother sat quietly on the far side of the living room, holding a coffee mug she hadn't touched. The silence between us was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Finally, Dylan spoke. "We messed up," he said. His voice was scratchy, like he hadn't used it honestly in a while. I thought I could carry it. The house, the show, the attention. But it all fell apart the second you disappeared. I waited. I let him sit with the discomfort. Then he added, "I never wanted to push you out. I just didn't know how to live in your shadow anymore." I replied with a truth I didn't realize I had been carrying. "You weren't in my shadow. You were just refusing to build your own shape. My mother didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, without looking at me, she said, I thought I was protecting the family. I told myself you didn't need as much, because you were strong, because you'd figure it out. I didn't realize that asking you to carry everything meant you couldn't belong to it anymore. That landed differently. Not an apology, but closer than anything I'd heard before. Still, I didn't soften. I said, what I needed wasn't recognition. I needed honesty. And a door that didn't slam behind me the moment I stopped giving. She looked down, eyes glistening, but I didn't offer comfort. Not because I was cruel, but because I had already given enough comfort to people who only understood value when it was gone. Dylan shifted. Do you want the house back? He asked. We're losing it anyway. Maybe you could. I don't know. Buy it. Save it again. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it proved nothing had really changed. I replied, I don't want the house. I want you to learn what it costs to build something real. On your own. He nodded slowly. And for once, he didn't argue. I stood up, preparing to leave. My mother asked, can we fix this? I looked at her not with anger, but with clarity. You can rebuild yourselves. That's yours to do. But I'm already home. That was it. No ceremony. No final hug. No neatly tied bow. Just truth left on the table, and the silence that follows when someone finally stops explaining themselves. Back at my gallery that evening, I unlocked the drawer, pulled out Dylan's note, and threw it in the bin. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed physical evidence that I was once excluded. My life had already shifted beyond that proof. I wasn't the man who begged to be let back in. I was the man who had chosen to walk forward. The next morning, I opened the doors to Found Form for a private walkthrough with a new couple. They'd lost their home in a complicated divorce and wanted to start over. When they entered the quiet authority room, the woman whispered, I feel like I can breathe here. I nodded, smiling, not because it was validation, but because it was the one thing I had longed for most. A space that didn't ask me to prove I belonged, just one that held me as I was. 3 months passed after that conversation at Aunt Carol's house. I never went back. Not to the old home. Not to the memories they were still trying to rearrange. Word came, through quiet channels, that the bank had officially listed the property. A foreclosure sale. Public. I didn't look at the listing. I didn't need to see photos of the living room I designed. Now stripped of meaning. Dylan had apparently moved in with a friend across town. And my mother was renting a small condo, relying on a part-time job at a boutique to stay afloat. People called it karma. I didn't. Karma implies balance. What happened to them wasn't punishment. It was the simple math of consequence. They overestimated what they had without me, and underestimated what I could become without them. Found Form was now 3 locations strong. Portland, Bend, Seattle. Each one slightly different. Each one built with the same core question. What does it mean to feel safe again? I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. But I had something they never understood: how to value ownership rooted in self-respect. No d'entitlement. Not dependence. Just clarity. I hired 3 full-time designers. All people who had left previous careers after being silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. I didn't ask for resumes. I asked for stories. Because that's how you build spaces that last. You begin with the people who know what it means to be torn down and still get up. The first press article about Found Form came from a wellness publication that focused on mental health through design. The writer didn't know my past. She just spent a day walking through the gallery and asked, "Why does it feel like every room forgives you a little?" I told her. Because every room was built by someone who had to forgive themselves first. She printed that quote, not as a headline, just a sentence buried halfway down the page. But I knew what it meant. It meant we weren't building homes. We were building wholeness. Then, one Saturday morning, I received a package. No return address. Just my name written carefully across the front. Inside was a photo. Me and my father. In the backyard. I must have been 11. We were painting the fence together. His hand resting on my shoulder. My smile crooked. My hair messy. On the back of the photo, just 5 words written in pencil. He would be proud today. No signature. No explanation. But I knew who it was from. I sat with that photo for a long time. Not because I needed the sentiment, but because I finally had the space to receive it without pain. I framed the picture and placed it on a shelf in the staff lounge at the Portland Gallery. Not in my office. Not in the lobby. Just a quiet corner, where the people who worked beside me could see it. A reminder that even fractured histories can leave behind something solid. Something you don't have to fix. Just acknowledge. I never asked if anyone noticed it. I didn't need to. Some things don't need explanation to matter. That week, I was invited to speak at a university design class. A guest lecture. Nothing formal. I talked about the layers beneath surface choices. How trust isn't just built through words, but through walls. A student asked, "What do you do when your client wants a space that reflects a version of themselves that isn't true?" I answered. "You build for who they are becoming, not who they pretend to be." The room was silent. Then one student raised her hand again. "Did you ever build something that cost you more than it gave you?" I smiled. "Yes. Once. But it also taught me what I'd never accept again." On my walk home that evening, I passed a house with a for sale sign. Fresh paint, new door, and in the front yard, a boy about 10 years old, helping his father rake leaves. It wasn't my old house, but for a second, it echoed something familiar, something honest, something earned. I didn't stop walking. I didn't need to. Because what I'd been chasing all those years wasn't home. It was peace. And I had already found it. 1 year to the day after I received the message that said, "We changed all the locks," I stood in the doorway of a home that was finally mine. Not metaphorically. Legally. Fully. A 1-story structure with clean lines. Tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by old trees and unspoken peace. I didn't build it to prove anything. I bought it because it felt like the kind of place you could breathe in without being asked to shrink. Daniel, one of my lead designers, brought over a housewarming plant that afternoon. He looked around the space and said, "It feels like you." I smiled. Not who you were. Who you are now. That meant more than he realized. Because the truth is, I didn't recognize the person I was a year ago. That man thought loyalty required silence. That boundaries were betrayals. That being useful would someday earn him a seat at a table that was never built for him. That man deserved better. And I became the person who could give it to him. I still hear from people who want to know what happened. People who watch the fallout unfold and are curious about the aftermath. I never give them the story they expect. I don't talk about revenge. I don't list receipts. I tell them the only truth that matters. I lost a house and found a self, quote. And the second one is harder to rebuild, but far more permanent. A few months later, I received an email from Lauren Fields, the journalist I once sat with during the early days of Found Form. Her message was short. She was doing a series on the after stories, not about downfall or rise, but what comes in between. She asked if I would contribute. I said yes, but only under one condition: that the piece focus on the architecture, not the architect. That it explore how design can restore identity, not just reputation. She agreed. The article was published under the title Blueprints of Recovery. My name was mentioned once. In the final paragraph, Liam Hemsworth doesn't talk much about what he lost. He talks about what he built after. And how that, in the end, says everything. Not long after, I was walking through the Portland location when I noticed a young woman lingering in the corner room. She wasn't looking at the materials. She was reading a short plaque we had installed. something Elena had written. It said, "There are places we lose ourselves to please others. And then there are places we build to finally come home to ourselves." The woman turned to me and asked, "Did you write that?" I shook my head. "No, but I lived it." Sometimes I think about what forgiveness would look like, whether I'll ever fully get there, but I've come to understand it isn't something you grant like a prize. It's something that happens slowly, over years, in the way you stop dreaming about confrontation and start investing in clarity. And maybe forgiveness isn't even the goal. Maybe peace is. Brittany, the woman who once stood beside Dylan, like she belonged more than I did, reached out once. A DM. Short. Meant to sting. "Congrats on building your little furniture church. Still, trying to prove you matter." I stared at the screen for a long second, then deleted the message without replying. I didn't even feel the usual heat of anger. Just a quiet reminder that some people will always measure worth by attention, while others choose to build things no one sees until they feel them. I know which one I'd rather be. So here I am, a year later, no mansion, no headlines, no family dinners with forced smiles. Just me, a team I trust, and rooms filled with stories from people who were once erased. Every time someone walks in and says, "This feels like safety," I think this is the reward. Not payback, presence. Not proving, living. The story didn't end when I was locked out. That was just the opening scene. The real story began when I chose not to knock, not to beg, not to argue, but to walk away, quietly, steadily, and begin again with a door I built myself. Have you ever walked away from something that once defined you, only to find something better on the other side? I'd love to hear your story, because maybe, like me, you've discovered that real power isn't in reclaiming what was stolen. It's in realizing you were never meant to stay where you were never truly seen.